1943. Snow covered the stone bridge that crossed the river in the middle of the old European city, and the cold wind traveled between the buildings and pushed across the frozen water. The bridge was narrow, with high stone sides and iron lamps that had been painted black for blackout orders. That late afternoon, many civilians were trying to cross before curfew. People moved slowly because the crowd was thick, and soldiers watched from both ends of the bridge with rifles on their shoulders. They were not talking. They were only watching the time. The woman in the gray coat found herself stuck in the middle section where the bridge became very tight. She held a small bag against her chest and tried to keep her face down so the wind would not burn her cheeks. The river below made a low noise as the current pushed ice toward the arches. Children cried, people coughed, and the boots of civilians made a steady scraping sound against the stone. Nobody was smiling and nobody was talking loudly. Talking loudly during curfew hours drew the wrong kind of attention. A few men near the middle tried to move faster to reach the far side, where families would exit toward homes or small apartments in the safer part of the district. But because the bridge was narrow and the snow was deep, there was no fast way to move. People just had to wait and follow the bodies in front of them. The woman in the gray coat looked at the soldiers at the far end. They were checking watches and looking at the sun, which was almost gone behind the rooftops. When the sun disappeared, the city became harsher because patrol teams would move through the streets and alleys. The woman's bag was not heavy. It only held clothing and a few things she needed for the night. Still, she held it tightly because having two free hands made it easier to be pushed. The people around her were tense. They were used to walking across the bridge like this, but winter made everything feel more dangerous. One bad moment, one loud voice, or one wrong rumor could change how the crowd treated someone. It happened often in cities like this during wartime. News did not travel through papers as much as through whispers. A name or a surname could carry a story that no one could correct. The woman tried to stay close to a family that walked ahead of her, thinking it would make her less noticeable. But as the crowd slowed down again near the middle of the bridge, the people began to press sideways to create space. The family slipped through a small opening and continued forward, and the woman ended up alone in the center of the bridge with empty space around her. The lamps were dim because of blackout rules, so the shadows made her face and coat easy to notice. A few people behind her murmured that she was slowing the line, and others turned their heads to see why someone was not moving. She tried to keep walking, but the movement had stopped in front of her, and the crowd behind her pushed closer. She put her hand on the stone side to keep her balance as her boots slid on the icy surface. From the far end, a soldier shouted to move faster, but shouting did not make the crowd move. The woman looked at the river below. The water kept moving even when the people could not. She took a slow breath as the wind hit her again, and she understood she was alone in the most dangerous part of the bridge, at the most dangerous time of day during curfew hours. The crowd tried to move again, but only a few steps at a time, and because the bridge was narrow at the center, people could not spread out or pass each other. The woman held onto the stone side for balance, and her fingers began to hurt from the cold. She looked toward the end of the bridge where the soldiers were now checking the sky instead of the people. Curfew would begin soon, and everyone knew that being caught outside after the bell was a problem that no one wanted, not even families with children. The woman tried to move with the group again, but the bodies pushed against her, and eventually she lost the rhythm of the crowd. People around her became frustrated, and frustration during wartime had a sharp edge. A man wearing a long coat hissed at her to move faster, even though she had nowhere to go. And another woman pushed past her with her elbow held high, knocking the gray coat woman's shoulder against the stone wall. The cold stone pressed hard into her arm and made her bag slip a little. She tried to hold on to the bag and keep walking, but the crowd behind her kept pushing forward. The soldiers shouted again to move, but the people in the middle had no extra space to give. The woman felt her face warming from the pressure, and her breathing became shallow. She had crossed this bridge many times before during the war, but those times she crossed earlier in the day when there were fewer people and fewer eyes. Today was different. Today the whole city felt louder and more afraid, even without gunfire or explosions. The fear did not come from the sky. It came from the people. During wars, people learned to survive not just by hiding from bullets or bombs, but by hiding from each other. A wrong word, a wrong look, or a wrong name could put someone in danger. The gray coat woman tried to keep her head down and just follow the small movements of the group, but a gap opened in front of her again, and she could not fill it fast enough. The man behind her pushed her forward and said she was blocking the way. She told him quietly that she could not move faster, but her voice did not change anything. When people are afraid of time, they stop listening. The bridge was almost a trap now, open to the wind, watched by soldiers, squeezed by bodies, and nowhere to step aside. The woman looked at the river again. The sound of water and wind made her want to close her eyes, but she did not. Closing eyes during wartime made people notice, and attention was never safe. A few meters away, someone said they would miss the curfew bell if the line stayed slow. Another person said they might have to sleep in the lower quarter if they were late, and nobody wanted that. The lower quarter was cold at night, and patrols checked papers more often there. The gray coat woman understood that their fear was not truly about her. It was about curfew and patrols and rules that changed without notice. But during war, people often direct their fear toward the nearest target, especially if that target stands alone. The crowd moved again, but this time it moved around her instead of with her. A space opened around her because people did not want to be near someone who slowed them down. Being alone in a crowd was worse than being alone in an empty street, even because every pair of eyes became a judge. She gripped her bag tighter, trying to keep her balance on the ice, and wished the bridge would widen sooner so she could disappear into the city, like everyone else. The crowd slowed again, near the highest point of the bridge, and that was when the trouble began. Someone behind her recognized her surname and spoke it out loud, almost as if testing it. The people closest to the voice stopped talking and looked at the woman in the gray coat. The voice said her husband had worked for the enemy, and the word enemy traveled faster than the wind across the river. In wartime, people did not need proof. A single claim could turn a crowd into a court. A man farther back shouted that she should not be allowed to cross. Another person asked loudly if she was trying to reach the safe district with the rest of the real citizens. The woman tried to explain that her husband was dead, but her voice fell into the noise, and no one answered her. Someone called her Traitor's woman, and that phrase stuck. It was short, it was sharp, and it fit inside a crowded bridge where everyone was afraid of being linked to the wrong side. The woman shook her head and said it was not true, but the people around her were not listening to explanations. Listening takes time, and time was dangerous when curfew was near. The crowd pulled away from her, creating space around her as if she carried some kind of sickness. A woman with a scarf over her mouth pointed directly at her, and soon others pointed too. Pointing made the accusation look official, even when it was just rumor. A group of young men whispered that maybe the soldiers would arrest her. Another person said maybe she would be stopped on the far side of the bridge. Their voices carried a strange excitement, the kind that appears when people are tired of being afraid and are happy to let someone else become the target. The woman in the gray coat tried to keep walking, but now the crowd moved aside to block her path instead of letting her through. She stepped toward the side of the bridge, but there was no space between the stone wall and the bodies that pressed together. The soldiers at the far end looked toward the group, but they did not move. During occupation, soldiers sometimes avoided getting involved in civilian disputes unless the noise threatened to draw attention from commanders. The shouts grew louder. Someone told her to go back to the other side of the river. Another yelled that she should wait for investigation. Investigation was a heavy word during war. It often meant long questions, cold rooms, barren doors that did not open again. The woman shook her head and said she was a widow, but even that became ammunition for the crowd. "Widow of a traitor!" someone yelled, and the bridge echoed with the sound of the word traitor. The woman held her bag close to her chest and lowered her head. She tried to make herself smaller, but making herself smaller only made the crowd louder. Rumor was a weapon that did not need bullets. It only needed ears, and the bridge was full of ears. A child asked his mother what a traitor was. The mother pulled him close and told him to stay away from the woman in the gray coat. The woman could not move forward because people blocked her. She could not move backward because people pushed from behind. She stood alone in the cold, while the wind, the river, and the shouts pressed against her from three sides. The shouting became stronger as more people understood what the word traitor could mean during wartime. It was not just an insult. It was a mark that could follow someone into shelters, workplaces, or curfew inspections, and the crowd knew it. A man with a heavy coat told her to step aside and let real citizens cross first. Another person said she should wait for the soldiers to decide if she belonged on this side of the river. No one asked her questions. No one asked for proof. Rumor made its own rules. The woman tried to explain again that her husband had been taken months before and never returned, but the crowd talked over her voice. A few people clapped their hands to push her backward, and she stumbled against the stone wall of the bridge. The wall was cold, and the shock of it made her breathing sharp. The soldiers at the far end still did not move. They watched, but they were under orders not to interfere with civilians unless violence began. Shouting did not count as violence during a war where much worse things happened every day. The civilians closest to the woman moved away, so they would not be seen near her if the patrol decided to check names. People feared being associated with the wrong person, and during occupation, that fear was stronger than kindness. A young man near the center raised his voice and said that traitors should not be allowed to cross into the safer side of the city. A woman next to him said that traitors should be sent back or held for questions. Held for questions was another phrase that made people nod. It sounded official, even when no official orders had been given. Children looked at the gray coat woman with wide eyes. They did not understand politics or collaboration. They only understood danger and distance, and both pointed toward the woman now. The woman tried to make her way along the side of the bridge, thinking maybe she could reach the far end quietly. But three people blocked her and told her not to move until soldiers came. Someone said loudly that she should be checked, as if the bridge itself had become a courtroom. The word checked did not mean paperwork here. It meant interrogation, suspicion, and fear. The woman held her bag tighter and lowered her head. She could not leave the bridge, and she could not move further. The river below made a low sound as the current passed under the arches. The wind pushed more snow across the stone. For a moment, the shouting stopped, and the crowd simply stared at her, as if waiting for the soldiers to come take her away. The silence was worse than the shouting. In silence, every eye became a second voice, and none of those voices were on her side. The soldiers at the far end called out that curfew would begin soon, and people became anxious. Anxiety made the crowd even less patient with the woman in the gray coat. Someone said if she was truly innocent, she would have been escorted. Another person repeated that traitors did not deserve to cross at all. No one touched the woman again, but their words kept hitting her like stones. She saw no exit, no place to step aside, and no friendly face in the crowd. She stood alone in the center of a bridge that had become a narrow courtroom, surrounded by angry strangers, with curfew minutes away and soldiers refusing to intervene. She understood then that rumor had become stronger than her voice. Near the far end of the bridge, a resistance courier had been watching the movement of people and soldiers for most of the afternoon. He checked watch times, troop rotations, and the flow of civilians, because information like that mattered in an occupied city. He wore a dark coat with a shoulder bag that held messages, maps, and a small loaf of bread wrapped in paper. He did not draw attention, and most civilians did not look at him twice. The shouting in the middle of the bridge made him turn his head. He saw the crowd separate around a woman in a gray coat. He watched how fast the space around her grew and how quickly people pointed. Pointing was always important during war. It showed where the danger belonged. The courier listened as the word traitor moved through the crowd. He had heard that word many times during the past year. Sometimes it was true. Often, it was just a way for scared people to feel powerful for a few minutes. He looked at the woman's face. She did not shout back, and she did not try to defend herself loudly. People who were guilty often tried to make themselves big. She made herself small. The courier noticed that the soldiers at the far end did not move toward the situation. He understood why. Occupying soldiers did not want to manage local arguments. They only cared about curfew, patrols, and orders from their officers. Civilian problems were not their concern, as long as no one broke the rules. The courier walked a few steps closer, keeping his shoulders low so he would not attract attention from soldiers. He saw the woman press her back against the cold stone wall of the bridge. He holding her bag with both hands like she was holding on to a piece of herself. Her eyes did not move much. People who expected rescue looked around for help. She did not. She looked down, which meant she knew no one would stand for her. The courier also listened to the kind of rumors the crowd used. They did not mention specific names or dates. They only used the surname of her late husband. In cities under occupation, surnames became dangerous because they carried the memory of who had worked with which army or which authority. He knew the surname too. It was not the surname of a high official. It was the surname of someone who had once carried supplies for work, not for ideology. Many men had done that to feed their families. That did not make their wives traitors. The courier checked the soldiers again. They looked impatient, waiting for the bridge to clear before curfew. That meant the situation was close to becoming worse. When crowds became nervous about time, they took shortcuts. Those shortcuts were often cruel. The courier weighed his options the way resistance workers always did. He could walk away and let the crowd decide her fate. He could wait for the soldiers to step in, but soldiers almost never stepped in. Or he could take the risk of putting himself between the crowd and the woman. None of the options were safe, but only one protected the woman. The courier stepped forward through the bodies, moving slowly, so people did not think he was pushing. When he reached the space around the woman, he stopped close enough that she could see his face. She did not look at him directly, but she noticed him. The crowd noticed him too. Crowds always noticed when someone new entered a circle. He kept his voice low, so only she could hear. "Stay with me," he said. It was not a promise. It was a direction. And directions meant more than promises during wartime. The courier did not raise his voice or argue with the crowd. Arguing with crowds almost never worked during war. Instead, he reached into his shoulder bag and pulled back the flap just enough for people nearby to see the cloth badge sewn inside the lining. The badge was not large, but it was clear, and people in the city knew what it meant. It belonged to the resistance courier network that moved messages, medicines, and sometimes people when police or soldiers made it unsafe to travel alone. The courier kept his hand steady and said loudly enough for people to hear, "She is under escort." Those 4 words changed the air on the bridge faster than any explanation could. Crowds did not respect kindness, and they did not respect fear, but they respected escort. Escort meant someone had taken responsibility. Escort meant questions could lead to trouble later. A few people immediately lowered their hands, and others stepped back so they would not be seen blocking him. The woman in the gray coat looked at him with confusion, because no one had spoken for her all afternoon. The courier did not give her time to argue or refuse. He simply moved his shoulder forward and made space for her to walk beside him. Walking beside an escort mattered. Walking behind looked like following, and following made the escort look weak. Walking beside meant she belonged to the path he was opening. He guided her forward, and when the crowd saw her move, they parted just enough for the pair to continue across the bridge. The shouting did not stop completely. One man yelled that traitors should not get protection. But his voice did not carry the same strength as before. Without the group shouting together, his voice sounded thin. The courier ignored him and kept walking. The woman held her bag close to her chest, and her steps matched his, because walking out of rhythm made it easier for people to pull someone away. They reached the final stretch of the bridge, where a patrol team stood near a street lamp checking watches. One of the soldiers frowned when he saw the courier and the gray-coat woman walking toward them, but the courier did not stop. He held the flap of his bag open, just long enough for the soldier to see the badge inside. The soldier looked away and signaled for them to pass. Soldiers understood that resistance couriers were not to be delayed during curfew. Delays just caused reports and paperwork that officers did not want. Now, once they stepped off the bridge and onto the street, the courier did not slow down. He turned down a narrow side road and said quietly to the woman, "Keep walking. Do not look back." She obeyed. Behind them, the shouting faded until it was only a sound mixed with wind and river water. Ahead of them, the lower quarter was dark, except for a few candles in windows covered with blackout cloth. The courier knew the streets well, and he chose alleyways that turned quickly, so that if anyone tried to follow, they would lose sight of the pair within seconds. The woman did not ask where they were going. She understood that information was something she would receive only when it was useful. That was how people survived in cities like this. When they reached a narrow stairway between two closed shops, the courier stopped long enough to check the street behind them. No one was there. He nodded once, touched her arm briefly to signal direction, and led her up the steps toward the shelter district. At the top of the steps, the alley opened into a small courtyard in the lower quarter. A single lamp hung over a doorway, and blackout cloth was nailed around the frame to keep the light from showing on the street. The courier knocked twice on the wooden door, then once more after a short pause. Inside, someone slid a bolt and opened the door a few inches. A woman with tired eyes looked out. When she saw the courier, she opened the door wider and let both of them inside without asking questions. The room was warm from a small iron stove in the middle. Clothes hung from ropes near the ceiling to dry, and blankets covered the windows. The woman at the stove did not ask the gray-coat woman who she was or why she needed help. She only pointed to a chair and said, "Sit." The gray-coat woman sat down slowly, removing her gloves and putting her bag at her feet. Her hands were red from the cold. The woman at the stove poured hot water into a cup and added a small pinch of tea leaves, then gave it to her. The drink was plain, but the warmth of it spread through her hands and into her chest. The courier closed the door, locked it, and hung a second layer of blackout cloth over the frame. The room was simple and quiet. There were no flags, no maps, and no photographs. It was not a political place. It was a place for the cold and the frightened to rest for a few hours. The gray-coat woman looked around. On the far side of the room, a child slept on a cot, covered by a blanket that looked too big for him. Nearby, a small table held a loaf of bread and a jar of pickles. The smell of boiled potatoes came from a pot on the stove. When the courier told the stove woman that the crowd on the bridge had pointed at the gray-coat woman and called her a traitor, the stove woman nodded once. She did not look shocked. Rumor was not new to her. She ladled boiled potatoes into a bowl and told the gray-coat woman to eat slowly so her stomach would not hurt. The gray-coat woman took the bowl with both hands and nodded. She ate without speaking. Nobody asked for her husband's name. Nobody asked which district she lived in. Nobody asked why the crowd had turned on her. In this room, she was not a traitor or a widow or a problem for soldiers. She was simply cold and tired. After she finished eating, the stove woman handed her a blanket. The gray coat woman held the blanket for a few seconds before pulling it around her shoulders. The blanket smelled like soap and stove smoke. When it was the smell of safety in a city where safety changed streets every night. The courier sat down near the stove and took off his gloves to warm his hands. He did not look at the gray coat woman with pity. He looked at her the same way he looked at the stove, the walls, and the door, things that needed to be kept safe long enough to survive the night. When the child on the cot turned over in his sleep, the stove woman lowered the lamp. The gray coat woman placed her empty bowl on the table and adjusted the blanket around her feet. No one spoke. The silence was not heavy, like on the bridge. It was gentle. It was the kind of silence that allowed a person to breathe without fear of being judged or named. Before the curfew bell sounded outside, the stove woman placed a second blanket on the empty cot and told the gray coat woman she could sleep there. The gray coat woman nodded again and lay down slowly. The blanket was thin, but it held in the warmth. Her body relaxed for the first time since the afternoon. The word traitor did not follow her into the bed. It stayed behind on the bridge where it had been born. The curfew bell rang outside, and the sound echoed through the narrow streets like a slow warning. Cars stopped moving, windows closed. Patrol boots tapped on the distant cobblestones as soldiers checked the lower quarter for anyone who did not belong outside after dark. Inside the shelter room, the stove crackled, and the blankets trapped small pockets of heat that felt like mercy. The gray coat woman lay on the cot, her hands resting on top of the blanket. She was tired, but she did not close her eyes right away. For many hours, she had stood on the bridge with the river below and the wind against her face, and the voices calling her traitor had been loud enough to replace her own thoughts. Now, there were no voices. The only sounds were the soft breath of the child on the other cot, the small clicks of the stove's iron plates, and the quiet steps of the stove woman as she cleaned the dishes. The courier checked his watch once, and then placed it on the table. Resistance couriers did not sleep deeply during war, but even they knew that a warm room was a place to thank, rather than question. The gray coat woman pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and finally let her body rest against the thin mattress. She did not think about explaining herself to the crowd. She did not plan speeches for the next day. She did not imagine arguments or revenge. Instead, she focused on simple thoughts: heat, bread, tea, and the steady breathing of the child beside her. Outside, the war continued with patrol routes, blackout orders, coded messages, and border lines drawn by officers who would never know her name. But the label that had followed her on the bridge did not follow her into this room. Here, she was not judged by rumor or surname. She was only someone who needed a blanket and a safe place to sleep. When the stove woman blew out the lamp, the room became dark except for the small, orange glow from the stove door. The courier leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. His job was not finished. In the morning he would carry messages through the city and watch soldiers from a distance. But for a few hours he allowed himself to rest because the bridge incident was over and the woman was safe. The gray coat woman closed her eyes too. The warmth of the blanket and the slow rhythm of her breathing were enough to erase the sharp sound of the crowd shouting "traitor" when the word had lost power the moment someone walked beside her instead of away from her. In wartime, dignity was not loud. It did not arrive with applause or speeches. It arrived with small things: a person who did not look away, a stove that burned through the night, and a bed where no one asked questions. By morning, the city would wake to cold streets, curfew checks, and another day of fear mixed with routine. But the gray coat woman would wake without the weight of the bridge on her shoulders. The war had not ended. The occupation had not ended. The politics had not ended. But the humiliation had. That was enough for one night.